Hi, everybody. My name is Zeb Welborn, president of the Chino Valley Chamber of Commerce. Today, I'm here with Cathi Hight with the Hight Performance Group, and we're going to be talking about tier dues memberships. So with that, I would love to pass off to you, Cathi, to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how you're involved with tier dues.
Sure. Yes, so I'm with High Performance Group, and I started my chamber career in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is where I'm from, and I worked for the State Chamber of Commerce. And I have been a consultant to chambers and associations since 2001. So this is the start of my 23rd year, I guess. Yeah. And I've worked with chambers around the country creating new membership investment models. They look a little bit different. I usually don't like to call them tier dues. I know that's kind of what it is for us. Um, but it's just like, when you think about who started all of this, it was probably the cable company,
Okay.
kind of bundling channels and giving consumers choices. I would think that's probably kind of an early version. And it's tiered, but they certainly they don't call it that, right? To me, I think it's really more of like a benefits model, um, packages, bundles, but it's certainly based around value, perceived value, especially for the people you're trying to serve, which in our case are members.
Well, then you mentioned you've been doing consulting for a while. Is your consulting focused on just like that membership dues structure, or is it kind of holistic as chambers as a whole?
It's a little more holistic. I think my ultimate goal is to make sure that um, chambers, especially, that's probably represents about 80% of my clientele, that they evolve and thrive. Because I think expectations are changing over time, and if we don't stay essential to the businesses we're trying to serve in our community, then they won't necessarily be members, right? So that means that we have to change. We can't have the same programming, we can't have the same model, we can't have the same messaging, and maybe even as an organization, we might have to change over time, right? So as our audience changes and their expectations and the needs of the community change, I think we have to change as well.
Yeah, no,
So
absolutely. And so let's focus on the tiers due side of things. And the reason
yeah,
we wanted to pick your brain on this was because we're going through that process right now and we're trying to figure out how to shift. So we have the fair share model, I guess is what it's called. I did not know this
yes,
before I started chamber work. And then now we're trying to shift to that tier due. So I've been involved, I've been the president of our chamber for the last 4.5 years. And now we're trying to shift from that fair share model to the tiered dues model. I think it makes a lot of sense for what we're trying to do. But let me ask you some questions because you work with a lot of chambers on that transition from uh,
right.
fair share to tiered dues. So talk to me a little bit about that transition, how it looks like for most chambers.
Sure. And like you said, you're on the fair share model, and probably around 50% of chambers are still on that fair share model, which is mostly based around employee count, right? But we also um, charge differently if they're banks or restaurants, lots of categories for for banks especially. It's based usually on their assets or deposits. So we have like different criteria. It's probably one of the most convoluted models of all industries because we're basically selling the same thing, but we have a different price point depending on who it is, right? And some chambers, depending on their size, can have between 100 and 400 different price points. That's like crazy,
Mhm.
so it makes it kind of hard sometimes for us to um, really focus on how to best serve a member. Something that we don't always take into account is that businesses have different motivations to engage with us, and we treat them all the same. And I think that it's not a really good strategy to use because some want to support the chamber for what it does as an organization, maybe, based on your strategic plan, your initiatives, and you've got small businesses, you've got mid-sized businesses, you have different industries. So trying to craft, I think, a one size fits all is really difficult. I think that's important to kind of consider, because the way that I usually work with chambers is we consider, well, first of all, how many price points are we talking about, right? And typically it's between 4 and 6. That kind of takes that 100 or 400, down to just a few. And think really about who is that tier for? Who's the audience that it's for? I spent a little bit of time kind of describing who that audience is. So maybe that base tier for you is really just core benefits. It's core benefits, and truthfully, every member is going to get those core benefits. But we usually kind of come up with names that sort of describe that motivation to engage, and maybe just a short paragraph about who this audience is. So if they're a small business, and they're really looking to get the word out about their business, right? Maybe they're trying to grow their customer base. Then we might call that tier connect or engage, and really kind of focus on some core benefits. I look at that as sort of the entree to being a chamber member, and really sort of think about the kinds of benefits that would appeal to them. But we also do a little bit of pre-work, to kind of look at where the price points are now. Look at dues as well as non-dues investments for all the members, because sometimes you have a member that doesn't pay a lot in dues, but they actually engage quite a bit in some other non-dues activity. And that to me is a different kind of member, right? That's not probably a member that should be at the base level, but maybe someplace else in the model, just based on the fact that they are a pretty active engager. And perhaps, like maybe the perfect tier for them is somewhere in the middle, or even, one of those higher tiers. I usually like to think about having 2 or 3 core tiers, and then looking at having higher investor tiers, because that's where you can kind of drive a lot more revenue in the chamber. And truthfully, probably most of your members right now invest at the lowest level. And I don't think it's up to us to decide what a member's budget is. I think our job is to present tiers or bundles, and then based on what they're most attractive to, they'll determine the price point. And we can certainly navigate that with them. We can target members for upgrades, but we want to make sure that we get members to move up, who don't necessarily stay at that lowest tier. And that depends on how you design it, the kinds of benefits that you include in it. So I know you want to jump to transition, but to me, design is really important, because transition is just getting your members to move to that model. But if it's not designed appropriately, it's not attractive to them, and you haven't kind of thought about them as why they're engaged and what they're looking for, in terms of their chamber membership, then it could be flawed in design, and then transitioning to them is probably not going to be very successful.
Yeah, and I think it's just more so on like internal transition. So not getting our members on board with it, but maybe like the chamber itself, right? When you make that decision, say, okay, right now we're doing fair share. Is there, when you're working with chambers, is it difficult to convince them of the reason to go to tiered dues? What's the big motivator to do that inside of the chamber?
Um, you know, I think internally, I think we realize that we want to give members a choice, right? So it's appearing to be member centric, instead of saying, well, just tell me how many employees you have and what industry you're in, and I'll give you the rate. I don't think that flies as much. I think a lot of people are conscious of that. I think some of the so if we know that 50 or 60%, really kind of depends on the revenue category, have moved to a tiered model over the last 10 or 15 years, we know that that's a trend, right? I think people realize that tiered models are going to be easier to communicate the value of the chamber. It's going to be fewer price points, so that's definitely going to make it a lot easier for staff. And we know just from watching what happens to chambers that do go this route, that they're going to see an increase in revenue. I think that's probably a big reason why they want to move. And we won't know exactly what that projection is going to be until we start working on a member conversion worksheet and kind of think about where members are now and where we'd like them to be. And then we can do some forecasting. And usually we can see anywhere between a $15,000 and a $50,000 dues increase. So I think that alone kind of makes chamber pros and their boards think about, well, maybe that's something we should think about. But there's always concerns, right? Concerns that larger companies are going to drop their dues down to, a much lower price point. I would say that doesn't happen very often. And again, that's part of what you have to manage in the transition when you actually do work on conversion, because you're going to make sure that those members end up investing in the tiers that you want them to be in, right? But I think internally, I think it makes a lot of sense. You do have some chambers that don't want to make that move. Maybe it's because the price points of their members vary so much, especially at the higher level, that they might think that it might be difficult to kind of get the larger members, to kind of fit into this model, which is why some chambers decide maybe not to include larger members, but to kind of design a model that's really for those that have, a certain number of employees and less, and give them the option. And then they might, or sometimes they only design high investor tiers and leave the base alone. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. It's not, you don't have to go all in, but I think most chambers end up doing that because we're really dealing with different audiences, right? Small businesses, which make up the majority of our members, and trying to design 2 or 3 tiers for them. And I think the mid-sized businesses and the larger businesses are really a different audience. So if we can figure out a way to make it work, we will. And probably the best convincing to do is to run some internal reports and see where your members are now. And think about the fact that if you've got 60% of your members investing at the lowest rate, there's a lot of potential growth in revenue if you don't go to a tiered model.
Yeah, so now let's talk about a little bit about the structure of the tiered dues model, because we've been doing just internally, we've been looking at other chambers that have their tiered dues, and so what I'm gathering is there's a list of things, there's check marks that go across, and then you got the other list of things, and so the first tier has a small amount of checklist, the middle tier has a medium amount, the long tier has a large amount. Talk to me a little bit about the structure of those things. I mean, is it pretty self-explanatory what goes in the left, the small amount column, the medium column, and the large column? Are those pretty standard things? Are those things that, how do you decide what goes where?
Yeah, well, we always start with core benefits, like you said. That's usually what the lowest tier is going to encompass. But not always, because, sometimes chambers have like friend of the chamber or an individual membership, so sometimes we have to just think about what's really core, right? So maybe core is they get chamber communications, right? They get a subscription to that, newsletters, things like that, member pricing on events. There maybe there's not that much that's actually core, but I think the problem right now is that a lot of chambers give away everything. So sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out if it's core, then is everything you're offering right now that you're giving to all members going to be in core? And maybe not. Sometimes we have to make some hard decisions, like maybe ribbon cuttings aren't going to be core anymore. Maybe use of the conference room or being able to sponsor, right? So I think those are things that people have to think about when they're designing. I think it's funny that you talk about the checklist. It's one of the things I cringe about, because we don't want to make this sound like we're selling software, and so you get this at a basic level and then a few more check marks and it goes up and it goes up and it goes up. And personally, I never like to see chambers sell from the checklist. Okay. So the checklist to me is like a decision-making matrix, right? It's going to show all the tiers side by side, what's included, what's not included, and it's going to have the price. Now, if we sell that way, then the left brain makes the buying decision. And the left brain is just looking at what do I get? What does it cost? And that's a really linear way of thinking. But most people don't buy anything that way. Most people buy emotionally, which is on the right side. Okay. So people want to hear a little bit more about the tier. Words matter. The name of the tier matters. And, sometimes when people look at who's featured in that tier, it's a quote, it's a photo of a member. And they're like, oh, that's my competitor. My competitor is there. Really? They're at 2,500? Okay. Maybe we should be there too, right? That's the right brain. The right brain really kind of, it has like an appeal to something. Maybe it's a certain program. Maybe it's a certain benefit. But they're going to look at the quote and the name and the narrative. They're going to read that. And then the left side of their brain is going to decide how they justify paying that amount, right? So, which is why most of the time when you, I think, successfully launch into this tiered model, you do want to have a membership brochure and you want to have a page that's for a page or half a page that's for a particular tier. And there should be a member quote, there should be a photo. Why? Because that's going to make somebody look between 2 or 3 tiers and they're going to go, oh, no, I got to be here. So should you have the grid? Yes, the last page of the brochure. And some people do just have the grid, but I will tell you that the most effective way to sell it is through what we call kind of more of a persona, right? I'm talking to you because there's a difference between a member who sees a connect level, which is just basics, just core. And the next one says build. And they're like, do I want to connect or do I want to build? Well, there's a price difference between those tiers, right? You have to think of it's more than just the check marks, Zeb. To me, I want a member to actually read the descriptions, read the narrative. So if the connect narrative says, being successful in business is all about who you know, the chamber is a perfect place to get to know a lot of people, right? With over 350 members, this may be the only group that you need to engage in, right? And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, I'm new in business or I don't really know that many people. So maybe that's where I should start. But if the build one says, it's more than just making connections. You really need to understand business. You want to get advice. You want to learn how to grow your business in a smart way. And I think, oh, well, maybe that's more me, right? But when I get to the middle and it talks about influence, maybe as a title, and it's like, you want to be seen as an influencer, right? So at this stage in your business, maybe you're more interested in strategic networking. And I think, oh, well, I've been in business for 5 years. I'm not really connect and build. Maybe I'm more there, right? So that's how we draw people in to a tier that's a little bit beyond what they're normally spending. And are you going to get more benefits? Yeah, probably. But the way I always structure the tiered model is we start with core benefits. Everybody gets that. But then we have 3 or 4 audiences and we ask ourselves, what's unique and different about that group, right? What are they looking for? Because when you think about like a business builder or somebody who is really just looking at frequency, like I need frequency of exposure, I need to go to something weekly or monthly, then I'm going to be looking for benefits that are going to do that for me. But if I'm a restaurant or a retailer or a business owner that can't come to a lot of things, if you're just selling networking kinds of benefits, they're just going to stop reading because they can't come to things. So they're going to be looking for benefits where they get visibility, even if they don't come, like an enhanced listing or an ad in the newsletter, right? Or a banner ad in the directory is going to be more important to them. I've been in business for a long time. So, and I have belonged to many chambers. So usually the networking doesn't appeal to me, right? Because I'm a business investor. I'm looking for how do I grow my business in a strategic way? How do I meet the right people that I need in my business? Where are opportunities where I can learn from other business owners, but I don't want to go to a mixer. So I'm going to be looking specifically for maybe a round table or business owners sharing solutions, um, seminars. I'm going to be looking for just a different package. And I also don't have a lot of time. So I'm not necessarily going to want to come to a lot of things. So I think you have to think about who the audience is. And yes, sometimes there are a lot more benefits in higher tiers, but I don't think it's quantity. I think it's quality that matters, right? So, and sometimes there are benefits that are offered in some tiers that are not offered in another tier. For instance, if I'm a bigger business and you're offering your conference room as a rental, I don't need that. Why should that be in my tier? Right. And maybe what I'm looking for are priority invitations to advocacy events. I might be more interested in a reception that's prior to an event. I might be looking for something a little bit different. And the other thing that's probably newer that I've been doing the last 2 or 3 years, because I always design tiers with a group of members. I can usually tell when a staff designs the tiers because you can tell that it doesn't come from a customer focus. And that's where all you see is what I call a plus plus model. We're going to give you 2 tickets, 4 tickets, 8 tickets, 12 tickets. It just keeps going up. That's not a model that necessarily has a member in mind. That's the easiest way to build a tier, right? So I usually work with a task force that is representative of different segments that you have of your members. We show them an inventory list of the benefits the chamber currently has, and they give us feedback on what they value and what they don't and why. And I usually put them into groups so that what we're hearing from the groups is pretty common. It's pretty similar, but each group is different. They don't like the same things. They don't say the same things. I kind of engage them in an exercise to say, if we could put together core benefits, what would you consider to be core? Everybody should get these benefits. And if we are designing a tier for you, what would be something unique that you would like to see in that tier? And again, it's not the same. Now, and the hard part is then we have to take that feedback and then start to draft out those tiers. And sure, sometimes the members who are at the base level want everything. They want tickets to events and they want a free ad, but the reality is that can't be base, right? But so we probably think about core. And then as we design the second tier, and the second tier is always tricky because if that second tier is not sweet, they don't move. So you have to be really thoughtful about deciding what the second tier gets, because it has to be something that people go, oh, you get that in that tier, but you don't get that in the base tier. Okay. So if I really want that, then I have to think about going up, right? And the same thing with the third tier. What's unique about that one? And sometimes it's not quantity. I don't always put a check mark across the row. Sometimes I have a check mark for that tier, or it looks a little bit different in that tier, right? Like maybe you get just a standard listing at the first tier. Okay. My second tier might have enhanced. My third tier might be enhanced with one additional category and 50% off if you have a second business, same owner, right? It's kind of the same benefit. It's just that it doesn't look the same as you go across the row. That's why I kind of laugh when I say, you got to be careful about the grids. I think there's a way to design it so that it's different. Having a premium listing that's pinned to the top of that category, it's still a listing. It's just not the same listing, right? Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And so you mentioned some of those Let me start with this actually. So that first level, what are some of the like the standard things that is the base level that everybody should get? What are some of those things across the industry that you would usually like? These are things.
Newsletters, like I said, just subscribing to newsletters and e-blasts, member pricing at all events, right? Programs. Um, Being able to participate in member surveys and polls, right? Giving you some feedback. Um, Being able to be part of committees. That's usually kind of a given, right? Member plaque or decal, something that says you're a member. That's usually kind of a core benefit, although sometimes they all don't get the same plaque, right? Or decal. Um, if they're, I guess if the member pricing is available to all of their employees, right? Because we want them to attend. Trying to think what else is like really core. Usually it's a listing. Uh, it's not right, but like I said, the listings don't always have to look alike. Um, Referrals to their business, although sometimes if they're a friend of the chamber or an individual member, that's not necessarily included, right? But for some chambers, they say core is for everyone. Okay. If it's for everyone and they say, yeah, referrals have to be there. Okay. Um, Access to chamber staff. Okay. Not a lot, Zeb. I think in an ideal world, core is doesn't have a lot of benefits to it.
Okay. And then what are some of the ones like not saying in the middle or the large chair, but what are some of those unique things that maybe most chambers don't think about that you could include as part of your higher tiered levels, but maybe don't normally think about or put down um, as an example?
I have had some chambers where we've talked because it's really based on some of the larger investors where they might say, the chamber can only, like those true community investors who invest in your mission and the chamber as an organization, they're not usually seeking benefits. That's not why they're members. But they say, that if there's a way I could give back, I'd like to do something that could help someone else. Maybe that would be a great benefit. And so for some chambers, we have put in, we call pay it forward, like be a pay it forward benefit where they could sponsor a startup business to be a member. We've also included some benefits where there could be a contribution to the chamber's foundation or high school scholarship, fund or something like that. And they seem to, like that. I think that appeals to them because that makes them feel like, that's great. Like during COVID, for instance, there were 17 members in this one chamber who had a pay it forward benefit. And when the businesses were really struggling, and there were some businesses that said, I can't afford the chamber membership right now with COVID, the president reached back to those members and said, you've got this benefit, it hasn't been used. I have a list of small businesses that are struggling right now. Would you be willing to use your benefit to renew, their membership? And they all said yes. And there was a letter. It said, who the benefactor was, and that went a long way for that chamber, not just for those small businesses, but for those larger businesses who felt that their benefit was being used to help another business. So something like that, I think, can be really helpful. And I think when you're thinking about benefits for larger members, it's not necessarily about giving them things that cost you physical dollars, like a table, at your annual meeting. But you can also think about giving virtual benefits, things like, and I will only do this for really high investors, but having their logo on your chamber newsletter footer right? For those top level members, because they get a lot more impressions that way. Of course, every benefit that you give has to be scalable. So if you've got 30 people who want to take you up on that, that's not doable, right? You can't have that many logos on your footer. So you do have to think about what might be really coveted. They could be, they could be naming rights to rooms. They can be, something really nice that you could have on the wall, their logos. As your top investors, I've seen chambers really take advantage of the TV monitors that they have in their lobbies, where they feature benefits. They can feature videos of some of their top investors, share their stories, a little bit about their organizations. Those things are great, and chances are they already have those products developed, right? So it's just a different place where they can be showcased. If you've got initiatives that are you're funding through your chamber strategic plan, a lot of times, they're more than happy, to have those kinds of opportunities um, to help fund those kinds of initiatives. But you have to think carefully, I think, for those top tiers in terms of what's important to them and how you want to use the dollars. Most of the large businesses that I work with in building the tiered models tell me all the time, is there a way I can write one check? Because the chamber hits me up 5 or 6 times a year. If there was a way there was a credit or something that was built in, I would gladly invest at a higher level just so that you could figure out how to create an engagement plan for me. And maybe won't cover everything that I would give the chamber. And this is why sometimes we have a tier that's 25,000 and there are members in it because they use that credit to support some of the things they want to do with the chamber. And the chamber creates an engagement plan for them, and they just don't want the chamber hitting them up all the time.
Yeah, so when it comes to implementation of this, is there any I'll just say pitfalls or things that when you do it, when you're do it, that there's some things clearly to avoid any kind of issues with your members?
Hmm. Well, normally for an implementation plan, I think you have to work on the member conversion worksheet. Not all of your members renew at the same time if you're on an anniversary basis. So I think working on an implementation plan where you think about what your anticipated challenges are, what strategies you want to use, what's your plan for rollout. Sometimes you want to do a soft launch before you actually move to a larger launch, and you have to recognize too that your whole conversion is probably going to take you 2 to 3 years. It's not going to happen overnight. So I think a failure to the launch is probably a pitfall because people think, well, I have the model, right? So now I'll just go ahead and start rolling that out. But you haven't really given any thought to how you're going to roll that out. Um, and I usually find that chambers might take a couple of months just in the implementation plan, doing all the back office things, designing communication pieces. His members are going to want to know, well, why the change. Do I have to make the change now? I just renewed, so does that mean I can't take advantage of these new tiers? There's lots of things that you have to consider. So I think spending some time thinking about that, designing the communication pieces, they have to update, if they're using Chamber Master or whatever system they're using, they've got to make the changes in there as well, make the changes on your website. So a lot of times pulling the trigger is 2 or 3 months away because there's work that has to be done. Just because you have the model to be designed, that's the upfront. That's great. And the marketing brochure, but you got to think about the how and who. And do you need sales training? Because maybe people on your team are reluctant and say, well, I've got these members we're targeting, but I don't really know what I'm going to say. So I just think the failure to plan is probably the biggest pitfall of all. I think if you plan correctly and you know what members you're targeting to be at certain tiers, and you have to also decide if you've got people who are really close to a tier, are you just going to invoice them with a letter that explains that you've moved to the new model. And here's like they're being invoiced at tier A. And if they want to know more, here's a link. Are you going to do that? Are you going to talk to every member? Usually you don't have bandwidth to talk to every member. So those are things that you just have to really think about. So just take the time to plan out the launch.
Just out of curiosity, like how long would you say the planning process, if you did it right, how many, yeah, let's say months, how many months would that take to plan it appropriately?
And usually it only takes like a month or two to finish the actual design of the model, because I never have seen a chamber launch with the very first one we come up with. Usually it's 3 or 4 versions. And then I would say it's probably a couple of months of just preparation, creating the implementation plan. They're thinking about challenges, strategies, how they want to roll this out. We create a timeline, who's doing what. So usually it's a couple of months. So I would say most chambers from the very beginning are probably looking at 4 to 6 months before they actually pull the trigger, right? And that's conversion. I mean, if you're ready to go back office, you can start selling the new model on your website to anybody brand new, because there's no conversion, right? They don't know the difference.
Right.
So you can start selling new members pretty early, as long as your systems are ready to go for that. But the actual conversions themselves, I think starting that process 2 to 3 months, and they're usually off to a good start.
Okay, and then this is nearing the end of our discussion, but I had so the way that I'm thinking it, and I want to make sure that I'm thinking this of it in the right way. So we have like our chairman's circle, which are our large level sponsors, and one of the things that I did very successfully at the beginning was get a bunch of people signed up for that chairman's circle sponsorship level. And so I want to say there's like 5 different levels on that side of things, and then we have the three to, or you said 4 to 6, I think you said 4 to 6 kind of models
Cheers.
there. So what I'm thinking of is you have 3 on your like base model membership, and those are all the stuff, and then you extend that beyond into like, I'll say your investors or your chairman circle sponsor, whatever you want to call it. Moving on into, and then you have those 5 that are like those higher level opportunities for sponsorships. Am I thinking about that the right way? Is that how I should be integrating it, where you have these 3 and then it shifts into?
Yeah. I think having 3 higher levels, and the reason why I like 3 low, 3 basic tiers, and 3 high investor tiers is because they're 2 different audiences, and people oftentimes pick the middle, right? So we have that opportunity, but you don't necessarily have to roll sponsorships into those higher tiers. Um, that's why I like using credits, because sometimes they don't want to use a credit for sponsorships, right? Sometimes they'd rather use that credit to buy a table, to put somebody on their team through the leadership program. Maybe they just want to give you all of that credit towards a donation, right, to your foundation, and they don't want to do any sponsorships. So I have worked with some chambers who rolled, like they had like 3 levels of sponsorships, and they rolled those into their top tiers. So the top tier got the top sponsorship and so forth. But that's assuming that that's what they want. Maybe you're better off keeping sponsorships separate, and then, like I said, working with them on their custom engagement plan. And so what I like to do instead as a benefit that's at the highest tier is to give them first right. Okay, they get first right to sponsorships. So that means I'm going to go to them first. So because they're my higher investors, I'll give them the opportunity to decide what they want to sponsor and lock them in before I go to my probably to my second highest level and third, and then just kind of open it up and start selling. But I wouldn't necessarily include sponsorships in the tier itself, because I'm making an assumption that that's how they want to use their benefits, but that's not always the case.
Okay, so when you're, so then on those higher levels, so you mentioned 3 and 3. so your high level investor sponsors, like what does that look like?
Look like in terms of what? Price, benefits?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. So I'm imagining like on the membership, you get those like I think the things we've all discussed so far
Yeah,
today, and then you go into those the high level investors. Um, it sounds like it would be a totally different structure or a totally
it
different
can be. It can be a
plan.
totally,
So
yeah, it can be a total different structure. And, oftentimes it's about recognition, right? Giving them heightened visibility. Sometimes it's, like I said, priority invitations to advocacy events. It might even be more of like a leadership roundtable, so their benefits can look very, very different. Um, um, yes, they're going to get all the core things, but like I said, maybe their directory listings really different. We may have a profile, a leadership profile of them, in the annual meeting or in a newsletter. We may give them special recognition in the directory or on our website. So we can kind of look at. I usually break down the benefits by category. So there's marketing and promotion, there's relationship development, and there's advocacy, right? So I kind of create those categories and then think about what's unique for those tiers in those categories.
okay. Okay, well, cool. Well, I think, well, thank you so much for getting together, sharing your wisdom about the tier dues and how
Was it
best
helpful?
implemented. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I took a good amount of notes. So I really appreciate you giving that guidance and feedback. And if people want to get in touch with you, learn more about tier dues or your consulting services, where should I tell them to go?
Direct them to, well, Hight, HIGHT performance.com. And for those that are interested, like you said, in the tiered models, I do have a book called A New Approach to Tiered Membership. And they can buy the book on the website. They can also just have a do-it-yourself program that allows them to kind of use the book, gives them access to a lot of sample tiered models that we built for other chambers. There's webinars that come with it. And so for those that really want to just figure out a way to do it themselves, the book kind of walks you through the approach, gives you some things to consider when you design your model. It also talks about implementation plans. So I think that could be a great resource for them. They can find me on social media on all the platforms, and if not, they can always give me a call. But the website, social media is probably probably the easiest way to find me.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And I know we talked about this before we got on the call today, but I did enjoy sitting at the table with you at dinner at once. I think it was for Academy a couple of years ago. So I want to thank you for willingness to chat with me, share your insights, and please go check out that book and
Yes.
reach out to Cathi if you have any questions on tiered dues.
Okay. Thanks so much, Zeb. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye bye.